Before the walls began to consume the people behind them, they consumed certainty. In the year 757, in a city most of the world has never heard of, men stood on broken battlements and decided that death was cheaper than surrender. What followed at Suiyang was not simply a siege. It was the moment loyalty turned into something so extreme that history still does not know whether to call it courage or horror. The Tang Dynasty was not dying quietly. It was being torn open from within. The rebellion of An Lushan had already smashed the illusion of imperial permanence, swallowing great cities, shattering command, and turning the north of China into a field of panic and betrayal. The old order that had seemed as fixed as mountain stone suddenly looked fragile, like lacquer cracking under heat. Capitals had fallen. Armies had broken. Roads filled with refugees, officials, deserters, hungry families, and men who no longer knew which banners meant safety and which meant death. Across the empire, the sky over palace roofs and village huts carried the same message. The center was failing. And when the center fails, everything far away becomes a question of time. Suiyang was not the largest city in that collapsing world, and it was not the richest, but it sat where it mattered, along the routes that linked the rebel advance to the fertile lands farther south, lands the dynasty still needed if it meant to keep breathing. Take that fortress, and the rebellion could push deeper toward the empire's surviving lifeblood. Hold it, and a bleeding dynasty might buy one more season, one more harvest, one more chance to recover from disaster. That was the cruel mathematics of the place. On a map, Suiyang was a node. In reality, it was a throat. Whoever gripped it could choke a kingdom. Into that tightening grip stepped Zhang Xun. He was not born as a legend. He had been a scholar official, a man of the brush as much as the sword, one more servant of the Tang state before rebellion turned magistrates into commanders and civil order into a memory. But war has a brutal way of stripping away the ordinary. At Yongqiu, Zhang Xun had already shown that he could turn stubbornness into strategy and resistance into theater. He had faced impossible numbers before. He had learned how to make a smaller force seem sleepless, unpredictable, and unbreakable. He understood that when you cannot match an enemy in men, grain, or horses, you must fight inside his mind. Fear, confusion, delay, exhaustion. These too could be weapons. By the time he came to Suiyang, the city already had another loyal servant inside it, Xu Yuan, the administrator who understood the importance of the place and the scale of the storm gathering around it. Xu Yuan managed supplies and repair. Zhang Xun took command of the defense. Together they were not building a plan for victory in the ordinary sense. They were building a wall made of time. Against them came the Yan forces under Yin Ziki, part of the rebel war machine that had already helped break the spine of the north. The numbers carried the cold arrogance of near certainty. The defenders of Suiyang numbered fewer than 10,000. The besieging army was initially around 130,000 strong, a tide of iron, banners, siege pressure, and confidence. This was the kind of imbalance that should have ended quickly. A rational mind looks at such numbers and does not imagine a contest. It imagines an execution. But fortresses do strange things to numbers. Stone narrows the world. A gate reduces an army to a point. A wall turns courage into a multiplier and panic into a disease. Inside Suiyang, Zhang Xun and his men prepared to fight as if every hour had to be torn from the enemy by hand. The walls were patched. Watch rotations hardened. Weapons were hoarded, repaired, counted, and counted again. Men who knew they were outnumbered learned the discipline of acting as though they were not. On the battlements, there would have been the smell of oil, damp wood, sweat caught beneath armor, and dust kicked up by hurried feet. Below, beyond the walls, a vast army settled into the confidence of encirclement. Then the city began to teach that army what resistance could cost. Zhang Xun refused to let the besiegers sleep easily. At night, the defenders beat drums and raised alarms, forcing the enemy to stand ready again and again, never knowing whether an assault was coming or whether the noise itself was the assault. Men deprived of sleep do not merely weaken, they unravel. Their judgment dulls. Their anger grows clumsy. Their discipline begins to fray at the edges. And when the rebels had been trained into that exhaustion, when vigilance had become a burden too heavy to wear every hour, the garrison struck. Small sorties, sharp attacks, sudden violence out of darkness or dawn. What Suiyang could not do in scale, it tried to do in precision. The siege became a war of nerves as much as walls. One story from the defense feels almost too theatrical to be true, and yet that is the nature of great sieges. Zhang Xun wanted Yin Ziki himself, not merely his soldiers, not merely another day bought at the gates. He wanted the mind at the center of the rebel host shaken. So the defenders played a trick, sending useless shots that made the enemy believe the city was nearly out of arrows. The message ran inward through the besieging lines, toward the rebel commander. Relief, laughter, contempt. Then an arrow flew for real, aimed not at the mass but at the man, and Yin Ziki was struck in the eye. For a smaller force, such moments mattered beyond the wound itself. They proved that the giant outside the walls could still be touched. Every attack the rebels expected to crush the city instead cost them more time, more blood, more certainty. Thousands died in repeated assaults. The defenders, impossibly, were still there. A fortress that should have collapsed became a thorn buried deep in the rebellion's advance. Somewhere far beyond those walls, in places the defenders would never see, Tang's survival was being purchased by men whose world had shrunk to ladders, arrows, stones, and the sound of drums in the dark. But walls do not eat, and men do. That was the truth slowly approaching them. Every success deepened the trap. A garrison that holds too long without relief begins to win itself into starvation. At first there were stores, then rationing. Then the careful lie every commander tells his men, that help will come soon, that another convoy, another provincial army, another loyal governor is already on the road. Yet the Tang world beyond Suiyang was crippled by fear, rivalry, distance, and self-preservation. Loyalists existed, but loyalty is not the same as rescue. Too many commanders were guarding their own positions, counting their own dangers, measuring the cost of marching toward a city that looked almost doomed already. As the siege dragged on, the rebels tightened the ring. The city's defenders fought battle after battle, but a fortress under encirclement is not only wounded by weapons, it is slowly hollowed by hunger. Grain dwindled, horses became meat. Then even the ordinary hierarchy of survival began to collapse. Men chewed what should never have been called food: leaves, scraps, whatever could be softened, boiled, swallowed, or imagined into sustenance. The body can be ordered forward by honor for only so long before the stomach begins its own rebellion. Still, Zhang Xun would not yield. Still, Xu Yuan would not open the gates. They understood what surrender meant beyond themselves. If Suiyang fell too soon, the road south opened wider. The rebellion would gain not just another city, but momentum. Time, that invisible currency of dynasties, would be handed to the enemy. So they chose the most terrible bargain a commander can choose. They would spend the people of the fortress to keep the empire alive a little longer. And now the story crosses the threshold from military epic into moral darkness. Because the enemy outside the walls was no longer the only thing closing in. Hunger was inside. Despair was inside. The kind of silence that falls when men realize rescue may never come was inside. Suiyang was still standing, but the fortress had begun to turn inward, and the price of holding one more day was about to become almost unbearable. Then came the point at which language starts to fail. Historians can record famine. They can record siege, attrition, desperation, ration collapse. But there is a moment in some wars when words that usually separate civilization from nightmare stop working, because the event itself has crossed that border. At Suiyang, the defenders crossed it with open eyes. Tradition remembers that when nothing else remained, Zhang Xun began with his own household, sacrificing his concubine before asking others to endure what no city should endure. Whether every detail reached later generations untouched is less important than what the surviving record makes brutally clear. The garrison and the people inside those walls descended into cannibalism, not as rumor, not as a slander invented by enemies, as a fact so dark that it has clung to the siege ever since, poisoning every simple word of praise. Children vanished into the arithmetic of survival. Women, the elderly, the weak, those who could no longer defend themselves against the logic of starvation, became part of the fortress's final reserve. The city did not simply run out of food. It devoured its own humanity to keep resisting. And still, the walls held. That is what makes Suiyang unbearable. If the city had fallen quickly after crossing that line, the horror would still be vast. But history might treat it only as a final spasm of a doomed garrison. Instead, the defenders continued to resist with enough fury to keep wounding the rebellion's timetable. Their suffering was not meaningless in the military sense. It mattered. That is the wound at the center of the story. The atrocity and the achievement are bound together so tightly that they cannot be separated without lying about what happened. Inside the city, men who had once stood as officials, soldiers, laborers, and fathers were now little more than bone held together by discipline. Imagine the battlements then, not triumphant warriors in shining armor, but hollow faces, cracked lips, hands trembling from weakness even as they lifted bows and spears. The smell would have been unbearable. Rot, smoke, human waste, blood gone old in the summer heat, the air thick, the wells precious, the streets quieter than they should have been because too many voices were gone. Yet somewhere on those walls, there were still men who could answer the enemy with arrows, stones, curses, and the terrible force of those who no longer feared death because they had already gone past what life was supposed to be. Outside, Yinziki kept pressing. The rebels had expected a siege. They had not expected a fortress willing to descend so far, rather than kneel. Assaults continued. The defenders answered with whatever remained in them. But starvation is a slower conqueror than steel, and more certain. The garrison shrank. The civilian population was consumed by siege, by famine, by violence, by the fortress itself. Some sources suggest that tens of thousands once trapped within Suiyang's walls were reduced to a remnant so small that the city seemed half dead before the final breach ever came. And beyond Suiyang, the larger war was moving. This is where the siege becomes more than local tragedy. While the rebels bled time and manpower against Suiyang, the Tang court and loyal commanders gained space to regroup. The rebellion, for all its early violence and momentum, was not an unstoppable flood. It needed movement, supply, confidence, and the ability to keep pressing into the rich regions that could sustain conquest. Suiyang helped deny that. It blocked, delayed, and exhausted. It forced the enemy to pay for passage in months and corpses. In the survival of empires, that can be enough. A single strong point, held long beyond reason, can distort an entire campaign. What happened in that starving fortress helped keep the rebellion from sweeping south with the speed it needed. A city died in order to buy time for a dynasty. At last, time ran out for the city itself. By the end, the defenders were too few and too weak to maintain the impossible any longer. The walls had given all they could give. When Suiyang finally fell, it did not fall as a city still rich with men and stores. It fell as a carcass that had somehow continued to fight. The rebels entered a place of ruin and exhaustion. Zhang Xun, Yuan, and the surviving loyalists were captured. They had been offered chances before, or so later tradition would insist, to bend, to submit, to save themselves by entering the service of the victorious. They refused. Men like Zhang Xun had chosen their answer long before the gates were lost. Loyalty had become absolute. Whether that absoluteness should inspire us or frighten us is the question the siege still leaves behind. Zhang Xun was executed. Yuan was executed. Their bodies died after their city had already passed through something worse than death. Yet their resistance echoed far beyond the place of their deaths. The Tang Dynasty did not vanish in the rebellion. It staggered, bled, compromised, and changed, but it survived. The rebellion that had seemed capable of remaking the empire by force began, over time, to lose that terrible momentum. Many things shaped that outcome. Battles, politics, betrayals, shifting loyalties, provincial power, foreign assistance, imperial recovery. But among those many causes stands Suiyang, a fortress that bought survival not with glory in its clean, heroic form, but with horror. That is why the story endures. If this were merely a tale of courage, it would be easier to remember. If it were merely a tale of atrocity, it would be easier to condemn. But it is both. Zhang Xun can be seen as a savior of the dynasty and as the commander of a nightmare so severe that the word hero begins to crack in the mouth. Suiyang can be called a masterpiece of resistance and one of the most terrifying examples of what siege warfare does when all moral boundaries are ground down by hunger. History does not always give us the comfort of choosing one truth. Sometimes it hands us two truths that wound each other. War is often praised in the language of banners, sacrifice, loyalty, and immortal names. But beneath that language there is another reality, older and more honest. War is a machine that eats through law, ritual, affection, mercy, and finally the stories people tell themselves about who they are. Power demands obedience, empires demand endurance, faith demands surrender to something greater than the self, and sometimes all three demands meet inside one set of walls, until the people trapped there are asked to prove their loyalty by becoming strangers to their own humanity. That is the tragic wonder of Suiyang. A doomed city held long enough to help save a dynasty, and in saving it, revealed what dynasties can cost. The fortress did not just resist the enemy, it consumed itself, layer by layer, until all that remained was the barest iron core of refusal. Perhaps that is why we remember it, not because it reassures us about the nobility of the past, but because it warns us how thin the line can be between devotion and abyss when states begin to collapse. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell us whether Suiyang should be remembered first as a triumph of loyalty or as a warning about what war turns loyalty into. And if you want more journeys into the darkest turning points of history, give the video a like. Stay curious, stay with us, and until the next journey,